Never mind the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory X-Files crowd for a moment. There is something in our skies that contemporary science can't explain. Military pilots have documented evidence. Aviation experts say conclusively that these unexplained anomalous phenomena don't seem to move like any type of aircraft or spacecraft we're aware of, and they move in ways that should be impossible under our understanding of how physics works. And there's a growing movement in the aviation, aeronautics, and science communities that says, hey, never mind the little green men narrative. These UAP pose a series of real-world problems.
From a national security perspective, just having unknowns into itself is a serious issue. It has nothing to do necessarily with us drawing a conclusion about their origin and thus attaching some type of threat narrative with that conclusion.
Former Navy Lieutenant Ryan Graves is one of the folks leading the charge on what I'm calling the UAP PR campaign, because solving these problems is going to require a dramatic shift in government policy, public perception, and the way these conversations are framed. Ryan has personally experienced UAP while flying Navy fighter jets, and you'll recognize him from his testimony to Congress this summer. And today he joins us to discuss his national campaign to destigmatize the reporting of UAPs, demystify the phenomena, and de-escalate this wildly unfounded speculation in a field where the conversation has traditionally been driven by folks like this guy.
What if what we have there is an extraterrestrial skull?
I'm Dusty Weiss. For PodCamp Media, this is Lead Balloon, a podcast about important tales from the world of PR marketing and branding, told by the well-meaning communications professionals who live them. We are speaking today to former Navy Lieutenant Ryan Graves, an F-18 pilot with more than a decade of experience behind the stick of perhaps the greatest fighter jet in history. He served tours in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Inherent Resolve. He's also the first active duty pilot to come forward publicly about UAP sightings. He was one of 3 experts to testify in front of Congress at this summer's high-profile UAP hearing, and he's currently dividing his time between several different ventures in that domain, including as a founder of Americans for Safe Aerospace, an organization for military and civilian pilots to advocate for support, research, and public information about aviation UAP encounters. So, Lieutenant Graves, thank you so much for bringing your expertise and joining us here on Lead Balloon.
Well, it's my pleasure for being here, Dusty. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I got to start, Lieutenant Graves, by saying this is not a podcast about the paranormal. This is not an aviation show. This is a show about communicating strategically, about shaping public opinion, and driving the discourse on important topics of global interest. And that's why I think that your story is so riveting, frankly, because you didn't set out to titillate or scare or amuse the American populace. You're not trying to convince anyone to believe in little green men. In a very matter-of-fact way, you and your colleagues have identified a problem and want to get real about finding a solution for that problem. So what is the problem from your perspective, and why should we be paying attention?
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it and introduce it. And really, the problem's pretty simple. There are things that are in our skies that, whether because they are something that we just truly don't understand, or whether our systems are just not capable of it, we don't know what they are. We can identify them as something that's physical. That's something that we have to worry about as a matter of aviation safety. But more so, we also don't know where they're coming from. So they also represent a potential strategic threat. Is this an adversary? Is this something that our systems are showing as an example of degraded performance? Or is this something that is in another category, something totally unknown? And all those different things are just options, essentially potential conclusions that we could reach. But where we are right now is essentially we are at a point where we know there are things that are unidentified. Our government, United States government anyways, has admitted that. The Pentagon has admitted that. And right now, we're in a state of data collection.
Certainly. Well, and you and others like you, particularly in this hearing that took place in front of Congress this summer, you have identified these things as a national security threat. And I don't think it's alarmist to say that, but can we drill down on that a little bit? Why is this a national security threat?
Certainly. One of the most important things that we do as tactical aviators is to identify friend from foe. For us, being able to identify targets is key to our performance. When we zoom out and we look at the United States in general and the way we secure our airspace, Those systems are all designed in order to look for and detect unknowns and then characterize them as something that's known. So we put a lot of infrastructure, a lot of care into figuring out who's who in the zoo, as we say. And so when we have a particular type of threat, a certain thing that we've characterized as real, as something we can identify with our systems, and we have admitted very broadly and publicly now that this is something that we have not identified, we need to identify these unknowns, because if we don't, then we're just broadcasting that there is a weakness that China or some other adversary could take advantage of. And we've seen that even just this year with the flyover of the Chinese spy balloon. So from a national security perspective, just having unknowns is unto itself is a serious issue. It has nothing to do necessarily with us drawing a conclusion about their origin and thus attaching some type of threat narrative with that conclusion.
During the congressional hearing this summer, a lot was made of the stigma around reporting these sort of sightings. And I want to get into that stigma with you, because the obvious question that most people ask is, well, if this is such a threat, why is nobody talking about it? That stigma explains that. But first, I want to talk about your personal experience with UAP. What did you see and experience when you were a pilot flying over the Atlantic seaboard?
Yeah, so I'll walk you into how that kind of acquisition works and what my experiences actually were. But when we're flying around the F-18, our primary sensor for tactics and even navigating around and keeping ourselves clear of normal traffic is our radar system. In this case, the APG-79, which we had just upgraded to, we were using that to essentially be able to see all the way out in front of us. And that allows us to see quite a ways out and see pretty small objects. And what we would see initially when we upgraded our radar were objects on our radar's display that we weren't expecting to be in our area. So what this is representing to us is that there's something in front of us at this location that is performing in a certain way. So we can see how fast it's moving, we can see the altitude, we can see which way it's essentially flying, all this kinematic information.
And just to put this in a little further perspective here, we're not talking about something like right in front of you when I'm driving a truck down a highway. We're talking about something 30 miles, 60 miles out in the horizon.
Yeah, exactly. So we haven't really funneled ourselves in yet, but the radar can see quite a ways out, and without really assigning a number to it, it's well beyond what we would call the visual range. I'll say that loosely. And so these are out there. We're primarily interacting with this information on our radar displays. And so that's when we first noticed there was a problem. Eventually, as we flew near these objects with our radars locked onto them, our advanced targeting forward-looking infrared system, or AT FLIR, which is essentially an electro-optical system that has normal camera-like qualities as well as being able to see in the infrared range. And what this was doing is, when we got close enough, we would actually be able to physically see an object on that camera system. And what we were seeing, at least what I saw, was what looked like a single source of IR energy coming from that point.
So IR energy, putting that in layman's terms, it's a source of heat, or rather a differentiation in the temperature from the rest of the environment, yeah?
Correct. Both are generally accurate. And what you described in the latter explanation is how our sensor essentially works on the screen. It's not going to only show heat, it's going to show the background temperature as well as the objects that are relative hot or cold to that object. These objects were presenting as either hot or cold, depending on the scenario. My personal experience, I was often seeing them cold. In other cases, they were hot. Once we got it on that FLIR system, that's when it really confirmed to us that that was a physical object, that was something that we truly had to respect from a safety standpoint. Eventually, we would try to see these with our own eyeballs. So we're continuing to fly in. We picked it up with our radar. We picked it up with our FLIR system. Next, we're starting to get what we call a screaming tone in our ear. And what that is our short-range missile that's on our wingtip with its sensor on it is now acquiring this target that we've locked onto, and it's providing a good lock and a good tone on that object. So it's now a third sensor, independent sensor, that's providing correlation to this target. And then we would come into this object, we'd slow down. Typically, we'd try to approach ones that were stationary. At least that was what I would do. And so we try to slow down as much as we could, and we'd be trying to look up at it as we approach it. And now all this information I described from my radar, from my FLIR, from my weapon systems, different, even some other kind of receivers that we won't go into, This information is now being projected onto my visor, onto my helmet. So as I look out into the world, it's saying, hey, here's where we're locked up. Here's where you should be seeing the object as I fly up. And we'd be only a few hundred feet away. And we do this all the time at merges, is try to get, we assess the object or the other aircraft as we're traveling at 1,200 knots relative closure to each other, quite high. This is 200 knots relative closure on a stationary object. Should be very simple. And yet, even with all our sensors telling us where to look, we couldn't see the objects.
Really? And so at that point, we're talking about something that it's showing up on these multiple different sensor systems, but you're not able to confirm it with your eyeballs yourself. And yet were you ever able to see one of these things with your own eyes, or was it always just the sensors?
So for me personally, my personal experience was that I was only able to acquire it through the sensors. I would come up to the merges and I would not be able to see them, much like I just described. And that was essentially the status quo for maybe the next several weeks as this issue continued. We began to simply just stay away from the objects. We would go to a new sub-training area in our working areas if one was in that area, instead of just kind of ignoring it or assuming it wasn't a physical object. And eventually, about 3 weeks after, we had our first near midair with one of these objects. And what that means is it was an unexpected close pass by one of these objects. So that's different than us going up to a merge purposefully in order to examine it. This was totally an unknown to the pilot at the time. And what happened was, it was 2 aircraft from my squadron with 4 people total. Essentially, the 2 aircraft were flying side by side up to the working areas, and they climb up. They fly out to this point over the ocean, and that point is like a stoplight, essentially, where all the traffic goes through there. And so you have departing traffic 1,000 feet below, arriving traffic here, and then once you get past that point, you disperse into your area. Well, right at that point, was one of these objects that was completely stationary. It was one of the kinematic profiles that we would see out of these objects, where they were completely stationary over the ground without due regard for the wind, right? So high winds, 50, 60, 70 knots, and you have this object stationary at, say, 12,000 feet. That was a scenario, although the aircrew at the time did not have a radar lock on this object. They were unaware of it. And they proceeded through that point, and directly at that point was one of these objects. It came within about 50 feet of the lead aircraft, and it split the section, went between the 2 aircraft. The pilot in the lead aircraft was able to gain a visual sighting of the object, and this was the first time that we had been able to do so. And he described it as a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. He estimated the diameter to be about 5 to 15 feet. And that was the first time that we've had that physical description of the object, although we had it on subsequent events and subsequent near midairs later down the road.
This kept happening over a course of how long while you guys were operating in this theater?
Well, we left the area in 2015, and that's when I stopped having these personal experiences where they were my squadron. Us, we left, the entire squadron left on deployment. And so that made it about a year and a half that we were experiencing this. When we left, there was no assumption or really anything other than jokes about UFOs or UAPs. We just assumed, we went from assuming it was a radar glitch to assuming it was like a blue air threat or a blue program that had been started operating in the wrong area, which is why
top secret American
something like
aircraft.
that, perhaps. Yeah. Even though it didn't really make sense, that's what we assumed. And then as we were leaving, there was concern that maybe this was an adversary, that someone was, potentially using this as an opportunity to learn about our aircraft and our tactics and our frequencies that we put out and all that good information. And this was a method to do so. Perhaps, multiple reasons here. But we left, and we assumed the problem would, at least I did, assume the problem would continue to escalate. Pilots were continuing to have these issues, and they continue to have these issues all the way up to just my last report was about 2 months ago of pilots on the East Coast experiencing these objects. In fact, when I came back from that deployment, I went to Mississippi, where I became a flight instructor for the Navy, back where I trained. And I had been training for a while, and about 4 years after I started that gig, I got a call from one of my former students who told me that, hey, he's all grown up now. He finished his training. He's gone through his training F-18. Now he's out in the fleet. And he went out and he was seeing these same objects about 8 years later. And so it's truly been a generational problem for pilots.
And this is something that, I mean, the military has acknowledged exists. It even comes up in flight briefings. Hey, if you see one of these things, give it some space. For the love of God, don't engage it. Don't cause problems. Just give it its space. But you classified this originally as, well, is this, blue on blue? Is this blue on red? Which is essentially parlance for, is this, a friendly aircraft that we just don't know about? Is this an enemy aircraft that we don't know about? Our mutual acquaintance, Dr. Michael Lembeck, with whom you co-chair an American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Committee on UAPs, Dr. Lembeck likes to classify this as the blue, red, green problem, being as there's a third option there, which we could jokingly call the greens or the little green men. But having observed these phenomena up close, what about your experience convinces you and the majority of aviators who have experienced it that this is not conventional human technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we talk about that, we typically define our limits of aviation technology by how fast we can go, how long we can stay airborne, how high we can go, how fast we can change direction, all those kind of kinematic things which are easily registerable on my radar system. And what we would see is that objects would be performing in ways that were not consistent with the type of aircraft that we have within our arsenal. For example, we have helicopters to go, stationary and vertically. We have fighter jets to go extremely fast, and we have, some surveillance aircraft that go very high, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses in each one of those categories. What we're seeing out of these objects is their ability to do all of those.
So they can hover completely stationary, and in spite of the fact that in the upper atmosphere, you're usually under some degree of hurricane force winds. People experience that all the time when they're flying cross country, and a trip from California to New York is much faster than a trip the other way around because you have the jet stream at your back. For an aircraft to sit completely stationary in winds that are that powerful would be insanely difficult, almost impossible under conventional technology. The other one being the rate at which these things accelerate, because I learned a lot about G-forces during my F-18 flight a year ago, Lieutenant Graves. And so I can tell you that just accelerating under 7 Gs is enough to put most people unconscious, let alone you have an object that starts at 0 velocity and accelerates past the speed of sound in an instant, as some of your colleagues have described. That would turn most human beings into mush, let alone rip any aircraft to pieces. Our materials and our bodies just can't take that sort of acceleration.
Absolutely. I mean, even at these accelerations we're talking about, even our computer chips and materials would not be able to survive these types of accelerations, never mind the human body. This requires very specialized engineering if we were to have technology like that. And I'm of the opinion that we don't have the technology to be able to have those types of fast accelerations. There's another interesting category too, which is, what pilots are seeing in the commercial sector with their eyeballs at very high altitudes. And this has been talked about a little more recently after the hearing. So this other category consists of maneuvers that are contrary to what we'd expect out of orbital mechanics that we're seeing at extremely high altitudes. And those are represented by being able to perform holding patterns, what appears to be at, in orbit altitudes with objects following other objects in, kind of scattered maneuvers. So a lot of very liberal, movement. Satellites don't just kind of move around for the fun of it. Everything's extremely efficient. So we're talking about something that is essentially performing like an aircraft at altitudes of plus 100,000, 150,000 feet. So that's a totally different class of, potential characteristics that define why that's different than what we would expect to see in that low Earth orbit or near orbit regime that we're starting to see objects as well.
Yeah, beyond just defying the technology available to us at this time, essentially defying physics, which I think is probably a big part of the problem that you have when you're communicating to the general public about this. Do you get that a lot when you're talking about these flight characteristics and people's eyes just kind of glaze over? Because I would posit that the average member of the public, American or otherwise, does not have a very good grasp of physics or flight characteristics or the technology and forces that make these things possible.
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, your podcast is about communication at its core. It sounds like, and policy and engaging on that front. And to answer your question, I don't engage on the level of detail on a regular basis that I just did with you, because to your point, that's not what people necessarily care about. People are interested in the fact that pilots don't feel comfortable reporting this. They feel uncomfortable. They hear that pilots that want to report it don't have a mechanism to, and they feel uncomfortable that this could lead to gaps in our national security and our domain awareness. And so, usually I focus on those issues, and then we can get into kind of the more specifics about the whys, where. But normally I try to keep it pretty high level. And that, I think, really resonates with people, because when you talk about that subject in that way, they're able to relate to it in a way that is, has an emotional connection with them versus just details they might not have any interest with.
Right. We're talking essentially about the magical conundrum of science here, where to the layman, most science appears as magic. But when we're talking about things that appear magical to the very most highly skilled and educated experts in a domain, we're in a completely and totally different plane here. And I think it's probably pretty difficult to get that message across. So let's talk a little bit then about why it's been so long and so much effort to raise this to a level of national and international discourse here. I want to talk about that stigma. If you were going to go out and fathom a guess at what % of pilots or aviators experience these UAP encounters, I mean, how many are we talking here? Starting with naval aviators and then maybe in that commercial pilot realm as well.
I wish I could give you an answer, and that's part of the problem right now, is that we don't have true quantitative data to be able to provide that guess. But that's where this conversation is right now. We really is trying to step back and convince people to report this so that we can get a better estimate of, how widespread and what the scope of the problem is. But, anecdotally, I talk to a lot of pilots about this issue now, and it's common enough where, pilots that have never seen anything in the past, that have communicated they've been pilots for 30 plus years, that have seen all sorts of things under the sun, are starting to see things now that they hadn't seen in the past. Is that more reporting? Is that looking up a little bit more? Or is that an increase in the incidents? We don't have that information either. And that's why it's been so important to me to push for increased reporting through my organization at Americans for Safe Aerospace. Because until we really have an understanding of that problem, not just within the United States, but potentially globally, can we really start to actually draw conclusions about what this is.
Americans for Safe Aerospace now has more than 5,000 members. Do I have my math correct on that?
10,000 as of last update, believe it or not, yeah.
Well, you guys did well in the aftermath of the congressional hearings. My goodness. So now 10,000 members. Can you speak to the membership a little bit more?
Well, we have a few categories of membership. So the 10,000 number is our general membership, and anyone can join that. They can go to safeaerospace.org. They don't have to put in a zip code, but we encourage people to if they are from the United States, because that will enable us to share that information with their representatives in Congress when we go to communicate to them, to let them know that your constituents do actually care about this issue. So we have a general membership for that purpose. We also have an advisory board where we have thought leaders from academia, from industry, from policy side in DC, from communications, and even all the way to the UAP issue. The UAP task force former director is one of our advisors as well. And so we've built out what we think is a smart cross-section of expertise of folks that are inside out. They're inside of industry. They're professionals that haven't been engaging with this conversation for the most part in any real professional sense, but they are now kind of stepping out to the plate to be able to provide their professional expertise to this problem. And then we have another cohort, which is our pilot leadership group, which is a collection of pilots that have stepped forward to put their name behind this conversation, to serve as advocates in this conversation as we move forward. And so that's a general membership groups of Americans for Safe Aerospace.
So, I mean, a significant cohort of pilots here who have firsthand experience with this. Why would you say more pilots do not come forward? I mean, let's talk about the stigma about reporting this here. This seems to be a big source of the reason why we don't have good data on this, why it hasn't been as much a part of the national discourse as it maybe ought to be. Why don't more pilots come forward?
Well, I think that's probably two different reasons for two different cohorts. For commercial pilots, I think it's really comes down to the fact that they just don't want to stick their neck up. There's really no incentive to do so. There has been historical incidents of pilots having professional repercussions for discussing these types of events, and that, those have been documented.
What sort of repercussions?
Well, there's an instance with a Japan airline flight where there was an object that was detected for, I believe, 40 to 45 minutes around and in front of this airline. The NORAD was actually activated to intercept and to respond to this event. And afterwards, the pilot, who was actually a Japanese pilot of that flight, lost his medical certificate for, I think, 4 or 6 years afterwards, after reporting it to his chain of command. He eventually got it back after that time period, but it was a direct result of that sighting and of his reporting of it. Your reputation, your flight hours, your physical and mental health define your ability to operate in that environment. And so identifying with something that is been stigmatized as a crazy or controversial or the realm of loonies, that's the stigma that, stops pilots from sticking their neck up and saying, yes, this could be a safety issue. Yes, this could be a national security issue. We're seeing objects. We're trained. A lot of us are former military, and almost all of them, I would venture guess, are patriots, and they're seeing objects and they're afraid to report it. And that's, I think, a wasted opportunity to take advantage of some of our best observers.
All right. Yeah. You decided to go public in 2017, and this was after the New York Times published 3 videos taken from U.S. Navy gun cameras. What was it that pushed you over the edge?
Well, in 2017, I was sitting on the couch in Mississippi when I was that flight instructor, and I saw the New York Times article pop up. I had crazy sense of deja vu, realized that I was watching a tape that I had been there for. I know when that the gimbal video was shot. I knew the air crew. I knew the voices. I watched that tape be debriefed in the intel space.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
And I thought, holy smokes, this is now on the front of New York Times. Where did we go wrong? Like, where was the breakdown? Because when I left in 2015, I had made the assumption that this would get escalated to the point of resolution within the systems of the Navy. And yet here we are, clearly with no resolution in sight. And so I called some of my colleagues that were on the East Coast still and the West Coast and asked if they were still having these issues, which they were. And then I talked to a bunch of the pilots in the ready room the next day when I got to work and said, hey, do you guys, remember those objects we were seeing, blah, blah, blah. And, they all immediately remembered it. So I said, hey, this clearly is not getting resolved through the systems of the Navy. I feel like I need to do something in order to, try to help resolve this or at least mitigate this issue for the pilots that are still flying over there. And so I reached out and I said, hey, I can tell you more about what was on the video because I was there. When you hear them talk about formation of objects, you talk about the situational awareness page. I'm happy to share it with you. I won't tell you anything classified, of course, but I didn't know where that was going to go, but I just thought maybe I could help in some small way. And, I didn't expect it to lead me to where I am today, but that's how it started.
What did your former squad mates say to you when you let them know, hey, I'm going to go public with this? I'm going to be the first aviator to speak out in a public fashion about this. Did they tell you, whoa, are you sure that's a road that you want to go down, or were they like, yeah, good, finally, somebody's going to do it?
You're making a very large assumption that we had that conversation. So, that's not necessarily how it went down. One, I didn't necessarily kind of cross-check and say, hey, I'm going to go public about this, because that would have been not a wise decision, I'll say. I was still active duty. There would have been plenty of reasons for them to tell me why that was a stupid idea, and they would have all been right. But that wouldn't have necessarily resolved the issue at all. So we didn't ever really had that conversation, but the conversation did engage later on when I was involved, because when I started speaking to the Senate Armed Service Committee in DC and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate, and when I started talking to New York Times in 2018 timeframe, I did reach out to pilots in my phone, I did reach out to pilots in my network, former colleagues, to say, hey, I'm doing this. I'm talking to New York Times right now. I'm talking to these people, and here's what I told them. And, I need someone to stand up and, validate what I've said. So would you mind or care sharing your story to these people? So that's how it happened. And that's what they did. So they spoke to New York Times off the record. They went to DC and spoke to the Senate Armed Services Committee as well. And they went back to their active duty lives and continue to live so privately.
So, I want to talk about that in a second here, about the progress that has been made already. But I did want to ask you first, now in your current role as a sort of strategic communicator, how do you fight back against the stigma of reporting UAPs?
Yeah, I just don't really address it or engage it. I just engage in the conversation about the data and about how to move the conversation forward. Most, if not all of the stigma is associated with an assumption that people have when they engage the conversation. They have an assumption that there is a conclusion if you say it's a UFO or a UAP, a conclusion about where it is or what it is or where it's from. And so really it's about just avoiding that conversation about conclusions. And people don't realize they're jumping to it. So it's a hidden assumption people have. Our culture and our society has molded us to immediately believe that anything unidentified is associated with aliens from another planet. And so these are all baked in assumptions about conclusions. And so I just focus on the data without getting to conclusions and ensuring this conversation gets steered there.
Even the term unidentified flying object makes some assumptions, because based on our current understanding of flight, to call these flying objects is completely erroneous. Flight involves forward propulsion of some kind. Flight involves lift generated by the movement of air over a wing. Based on the data, none of that applies here.
Theoretically, you're absolutely correct. If you were to quote unquote take a flying object and put it into space, it could no longer fly. And I'm happy the term is adapted to the more domain agnostic, technology agnostic, effects agnostic, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, which is a mouthful, but it's important to not delineate this conversation in any one domain because we just don't understand the scope of it.
So the understanding, the approach, the credibility of the people involved in this discussion, all of this has rapidly shifted over the last 6 or 7 years here, right around the same time as you got involved. Feel free to pat yourself on the back here if you think that you're a part of that, and I certainly do think that you are. But how and why has the public conversation changed over the last less than a decade here?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I'm sure there's probably, again, a lot of answers to why. I think, I've obviously played a small role where I've communicated about the experiences, and I've served as kind of a linchpin of being able to bring communications together for different aviation professionals to talk about the serious safety issues and pragmatic concerns that they have about this. And so I think I've been able to help build that conversation from that point. But more strategically and larger picture, I think the reality is that the tools that we're flying around with and that are available on the commercial markets are sufficient quality that it's very hard to just hide the fact that these things are there. We came home, we upgraded our radars, and now we're seeing these things every day. We're almost hitting these things. So, how long can you stop the conversation from progressing when that's the reality that you're living in? So I think overall there was a larger shift as technology got better, the tools in the average person's hands got better, that we'll the conversation will continue to expand to that degree. I'm sure there's a million other different reasons and players and motivations and stories associated with all of that I'm sure that we'll learn about over the next 50 years or so, perhaps. But that's just a little opinion there for you.
Even just over the last year, I mean, a little less than a year ago, we saw almost nonstop news coverage of all of these high-altitude objects, the Chinese spy balloons, the shoot-downs. Would you say that helped or hurt the cause? Was it a distraction, or did it get us at least looking in the right direction?
I think it was a very intertwined part of the story. I mean, just the weeks prior to that happening, there was a lot of talk in the UAP conversation about taking a look at our national assets and retuning them to be able to see slower moving objects. Why? Because we had been reporting and seeing slower moving objects on the eastern seaboard for a number of time. And so the Department of Defense retuned their sensors, and then they detected objects. And this isn't me speaking. The Department of Defense in a press conference publicly stated they retuned their sensors to look for slower speed objects. And so what happened was that we started seeing that there were adversary platforms that were in our airspace. Again, same thing we were claiming that could be a potential reason for investigating this on the eastern seaboard. And there were also other objects that were detected as well, and we haven't really got the full story on what those were. But regardless, I think it made a very poignant point on why we can't ignore these sightings, why we can't just say, oh, well, that's a balloon, or that's not something we care about, or we can just let that be unknown. The consequences are pretty dire. It's a pretty high stakes game when we talk about the security of our borders and our airspace. So yeah.
What about the media coverage, not just of the Chinese spy balloon, but also the media coverage that followed up the hearing in July that you were a part of? Has it helped or hurt the cause?
The media has been an interesting challenge in this conversation, although it has matured significantly over the past 5 to 8 years. I don't know how many times I've started an interview with the X-Files themes playing on the intro, and we don't see that anymore. We see reporters going around asking every member of the Senate what they think of the UAP hearings. There's conversations from AOC about government transparency and spending and lack of accountability. We have folks on the other side of the aisle that are talking about whether there are legal contracts and whether there's, really pragmatic concerns for our Congress people to be looking into. These are where the conversation has shifted within, at least in the halls of government. I think the media will be catching up to. Right now, it's still, I think the media is still kind of catching up on how to have this conversation in a kind of mature fashion. But again, with the hearings and with the way the conversation is developing in the halls of Congress, I think that trend of improvement will continue.
The organizations that you're involved with, Americans for Safe Aerospace, the AIAA, they're pushing for a centralized reporting process, a central repository for transparent data, and of course, the normalization and destigmatization of UAP reporting. What are the wins that we've had, and how much further do we need to go, and what needs to happen, in your opinion?
Yeah, so there's progress that's being made. One, there's the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which has been established within the Pentagon, and they're intending to serve as an whole of government approach to this topic. With that, they are holding the hammer on expanding the reporting that the Navy has been doing to other service branches, and ultimately, I believe, to the rest of the Department of Defense. And so, again, we started with no reporting on this issue, with small trickle reporting through the Navy, now with a dedicated program office that will be instituting service-wide reporting on this issue. And so that just gives you a little perspective how things have progressed on the military side of things. On the commercial side of things, recently, we've had NASA get into the game. They've announced at the conclusion of their report that they're standing up a UAP program office at NASA and assigning a UAP head of research. Their goal is to be able to better collect data on this and be able to evaluate and characterize what these objects are. With that, they also recommended the use of the Aviation Safety Reporting System, which is a NASA-owned aviation safety reporting mechanism for commercial pilots to be able to report issues. They're going to be modifying that system to be able to accommodate UAP reports, so they can start collecting reports from pilots through that, and that was their recommendation. So we're seeing increased support for commercial pilots to be able to report this. What I'm hoping to see is there be a cultural change within the commercial airlines to allow this reporting to really foster and grow. And I believe I'm seeing the start of that with the communications I'm having within the airlines now. I'm hearing this information being communicated through their command centers. I hear this being communicated on a much more regular basis to ATC control, who is then forwarding those reports. So we've seen tremendous progress on both the military and the commercial aviation safety fronts. Now, looking forward, we have what's, I believe, being called the 2023 Disclosure Act, which is about 60 pages of amendment in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024. At its core, what this bill will do is serve as a mechanism to declassify information within the government that's related to UAP. What it does is it appoints a 9-person committee that will be appointed by the president and congressionally confirmed. And it will also assign a presumption of disclosure to all UAP material within the government. And this board will make an assessment of each of those pieces of material to determine whether they can or cannot be released for national security concerns. And so when we look forward, we should expect that the information that is ending up at Aero will eventually make its way, or at least a large majority of it, to the public through this release mechanism should they get signed into law this winter.
With that sort of impetus then, if you will, to keep some of this information locked away and classified, and with the fact that maybe the average American still doesn't pay a lot of attention to this. I'm asking about both of these at the same time because I think the answers are related. But why do you think that this deeply mysterious issue is so far from a top priority for most of society?
Wow, we got a lot of problems right now. Maybe that's one reason. And, you know, much like in aviation, you got to work on the closest alligator to the canoe. So if this is something that's been around for a while and represents something that much larger than us, then, you know, we probably have more present small concerns that are relevant to us, perhaps. And that's just, you know, a silly way of kind of...
I think that you're right on
that's
that.
The truth, but like that's just one way of perhaps rationalizing it.
I think that there's something to that. I think that as human beings, we don't like problems that make us seem small and insignificant in scale. And I think that most people see a problem like that and say, just not interested.
Yeah, you know, I'll just say I've had this theory where a lot of times I'll engage with people or I hear the question, why should I care? Or why do I care? And I think a lot of people dismiss that question as they assume it's like, why should I care about something as interesting as quote unquote aliens or something that's an unknown such as that? Where's your sense of exploration or curiosity? But I don't think that's really what they're saying. I don't think they're saying, I just don't care on that topic. I think they're saying that because this would probably affect their worldview to such a large degree. They're saying, why is this so immediate to my concern that I have to destroy my entire worldview in order to be up to speed with you on this conversation right now? Why can't I just continue to ignore this? I think that's really what the question, what they're asking.
Former Navy Lieutenant Ryan Graves, founder of Americans for Safe Aerospace and Merged Point Consulting, also the host of the Merged podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Lead Balloon.
Thanks for having me, Dusty.
And just last week, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, released its latest report. It's currently looking into more than 800 UAP reports, as Ryan mentioned. Some of those date back decades, but nearly 300 are from just the last year alone. Only about 100 of them are from civilian pilots, the rest are from military personnel. And AARO reports that most of these can be explained away as equipment inadequacy, an error in perception, balloons, drones, or debris. But about 5% of them are just plumb inexplicable. Special thanks to Dr. Michael Lembeck, who introduced me to Lieutenant Graves and serves as his co-chair on the AIAA UAP Integration and Outreach Committee. This has been a special video edition of Lead Balloon, but we have 50 more episodes in our audio catalog. You can find Lead Balloon in your favorite podcast app and watch this YouTube channel for more audio and video content in the future. Lead Balloon is produced by PodCamp Media, where we provide branded podcast production services for businesses. Our podcast studios are located at the heart of beautiful downtown Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but we work with brands all over North America. PodCampMedia.com. Music for this episode by Ghost Beats and the Europa Proto-Harmonic Symphony Orchestra. And until the next time, folks, thanks for watching. I'm Dusty Weiss.